My name is Captain Tyron Sue, and I'm recording this because someone needs to know. The sky turned red on a Tuesday morning, which seems like the kind of detail that shouldn't matter but somehow does, like the universe wanted us to remember what day it was when everything ended. I was drinking coffee in the command bunker at Forward Operating Base Meridian when the orbital strikes began. Not explosions at first, but light, pure red light bleeding through the atmosphere like the sky had been cut open and was hemorrhaging. The coffee cup shattered on the floor before I heard the sirens, my hands already shaking from something my brain hadn't processed yet. Some primal part of me recognizing the end before my conscious mind caught up. Lieutenant Harris was shouting coordinates, but his voice sounded underwater, distant, like I was already drowning and just didn't know it yet. The Velcrin fleet materialized in orbit, not with thunder, but with silence. Their ships so massive they bent light around them, created shadows where shadows shouldn't exist, and when they fired their first volley into New York, I felt it through the ground 3,000 miles away, felt the planet itself flinch from the impact. The screens in the command center showed feeds from every major city simultaneously dying. London folding inward like paper in a fire. Tokyo's skyline collapsing into a crater that would later become a sea. Moscow simply gone, replaced by a wound in the earth that glowed with residual heat. Shanghai, São Paulo, Mumbai, names that meant civilizations reduced to coordinate points where cities used to stand. Private Chen was crying at her station, not loud, just tears running down her face while she kept working, kept logging casualty reports that scrolled faster than human eyes could track. Numbers so large they stopped meaning anything. 6 billion dead in the first 6 hours. That's what the estimates said before the satellite network went dark and we stopped being able to estimate anything. Harris asked me what our orders were and I realized I didn't have any. That Earth Command had been in Geneva and Geneva was currently a radioactive glass bowl. That every chain of command had been severed simultaneously and what was left was just people with guns waiting to be told what to do with them. I told them to sound the evacuation protocols. Told them to get every civilian within 20 miles into the underground network, the tunnels we'd built after the IO incident when we'd first learned we weren't alone and that the things out there weren't friendly. The sirens changed pitch, went from warning to evacuation, and through the blast doors I could hear them coming, thousands of footsteps echoing through concrete corridors, families carrying whatever they'd grabbed in 30 seconds, old men helping older women, children clutching toys they'd never play with again, the sound of civilization collapsing into a tunnel system designed for a fraction of this many people. I stood at the checkpoint watching them pour past, their faces blank with shock, eyes that had watched their homes burn from orbit and couldn't quite process that this was real, that the sky had stopped being safe and the ground was all that was left. Silence again. The wind tastes of metal. Sergeant Carver was organizing them in the deep sections, 3 miles down where the rock was thick enough to maybe stop orbital strikes, maybe give us a few more days before the Velcrin decided to dig us out. He'd been a teacher before enlisting, elementary school, and he still had that voice he'd used with children, calm and steady, and lying about how everything would be okay. I could hear him through the tunnel speakers telling people to stay quiet, to conserve oxygen, to keep the children calm, and I wondered if he knew he was teaching the last class humanity would ever sit through. The civilians filled every tunnel, every chamber, 60,000 people pressed into spaces that felt like catacombs because that's what they were, had always been. We'd just been pretending they were shelters. The air smelled like sweat and fear and the particular stink of too many humans in too small a space. But no one complained because complaining required believing you had a future where things could get better. I made my way to communications where Harris had set up a makeshift command center, screens pulled from destroyed sections and wired together with cables that sparked occasionally, showing us what was left of the world. The feeds were fragmenting, satellites falling or being shot down, but what we could see was enough. The Velcrin weren't invading, weren't landing troops to conquer. They were sterilizing, systematically burning the surface, turning cities into craters and forests into ash fields and oceans into steam. Someone had calculated we had maybe 72 hours before the atmospheric heating would make the surface uninhabitable, before Earth stopped being a planet you could breathe on and started being a crematorium. Harris was trying to raise anyone, broadcasting on every military frequency, every emergency channel, even civilian bands, his voice getting more desperate with each unanswered call. This is FOB Meridian requesting immediate support, over. This is FOB Meridian requesting extraction protocols, over. This is FOB Meridian requesting anyone, over. Static answered. Always static. Sometimes we'd catch fragments, pieces of other voices calling into the void, but never long enough to coordinate, never coherent enough to mean anything beyond proving we weren't the only ones left. Earth Command promised us reinforcements 3 days before they stopped broadcasting. Admiral Zhang's voice on the emergency channel saying the fleet was regrouping, that relief forces were en route, that we just needed to hold position and maintain defensive perimeters until extraction could be arranged. His voice had sounded confident, almost cheerful, the voice of a man who believed what he was saying or was skilled enough to fake it. I'd believed him. God help me. For almost 6 hours, I'd believed him. Then we'd intercepted a Velcrin transmission, not meant for us, just spillover on frequencies they didn't realize we could access, and we'd heard them discussing the destruction of the human fleet at Saturn's orbit, heard them catalog the debris field that used to be our last line of defense, heard them talk about Admiral Zhang's flagship, the way you'd discuss a particularly interesting piece of wreckage. The reinforcements weren't coming. Had never been coming. Earth Command had lied with their last breath, had decided that hope was more valuable than truth, had sent us down into these tunnels believing we had a future when they'd known we were already dead. I didn't tell the civilians, didn't tell most of the soldiers, just gathered my officers in a side chamber that used to be a storage room and let them listen to the recording of the Velcrin transmission. Lieutenant Harris vomited in the corner. Captain Morrison just stared at the wall and laughed once, short and bitter, the sound of sanity cracking. Lieutenant Zhao asked me what we were going to do, and I said we'd keep fighting because I didn't know what else to say, because the alternative was admitting we were just waiting to die, and I wasn't ready to say that out loud yet. The wind against the ventilation shaft sounds like breathing. The Velcrin broadcast came on the 3rd day. Not an attack, an offer. Their language translated through our computers sounded almost reasonable, almost kind. The voice of something explaining a difficult but necessary truth. They said they were preservation specialists, that humanity's time as a dominant species had ended, but we didn't have to go extinct, that they could store us, preserve our genetic patterns and cultural information, turn us into data that would outlast our physical forms. They said it would be painless, said we'd effectively be immortal, existing as information in their archives, accessible and preserved for study by future civilizations. They said all we had to do was surrender, come to the surface, let them process us peacefully. The broadcast repeated every hour, patient and insistent, and I watched my officers' eyes as they listened, saw something change behind their expressions. Saw the question forming that no one wanted to ask, but everyone was thinking. Sergeant Kim asked it finally. "Captain, is that really worse than dying down here?" He was holding his sidearm loosely, not threatening, just holding it like he'd forgotten it was in his hand. At least we'd survive in some form. At least there'd be something left. Morrison nodded slowly, and Zhao was looking at me with eyes that said she'd already made up her mind and was just waiting for permission. I wanted to shoot them, wanted to shoot all of them for even considering it, for being weak enough to choose existence over humanity, for believing the Velcrin's promise that preservation was anything other than a pretty word for extinction. But I couldn't shoot them because they were right, in a way, right that dying in these tunnels achieved nothing, right that maybe data death was preferable to real death, right that the war was already over, And we were just choosing how we wanted the epilogue to read. I said no anyway, said we were staying human until the last possible second, that if they wanted to surrender, they could, but they'd do it without me, without using Fob Meridian's resources to sell out the species. Kim looked relieved, like he'd needed someone to make the decision for him. Morrison looked disappointed. Zhao just nodded and went back to her post. Later, I'd learned that Morrison had sent a coded transmission to the surface, had tried to negotiate terms, had believed right up until the Velkrin incinerated his broadcast antenna that they'd actually honor an arrangement with what they considered livestock. The explosion collapsed. Tunnel 7 killed 32 civilians, and Morrison himself, buried under rubble while trying to explain to the Velkrin that we were ready to surrender if they'd just listen. We tried a breakout on day 5. Desperation move, tactically insane, but staying underground meant slow suffocation as oxygen recyclers failed and food ran low, and the psychological pressure of 60,000 people in the dark started manifesting as violence. The plan was to move at night, use the ash storms the orbital bombardment had created as cover, get to the old harbor where maybe, impossibly, we'd find boats, get to open ocean where the Velkrin seemed less focused. 50 soldiers volunteered. I took 30, left the rest to guard the civilians, though guard against what I couldn't say since nothing human was a threat anymore compared to what was waiting outside. We moved through access tunnels that hadn't been opened in months, hatches that screamed when we forced them, emerged into a world I didn't recognize. The sky was black at noon, ash so thick it blocked the sun, turned day into permanent twilight, lit by fires burning in the distance, cities still smoldering weeks after the initial strikes. The temperature was wrong, too hot, the atmosphere superheated by orbital bombardment, and breathing felt like inhaling from an oven. We wore respirators, but they clogged within minutes, filters unable to handle the particulate density, and we marched toward the harbor tasting ash and smoke, and the particular flavor of burning plastic that meant synthetic materials were melting somewhere nearby. Private Yuki spotted the first Velkrin patrol at the old industrial district, their war machines moving through the ruins like insects, six-legged things the size of buildings that stepped over wreckage with a grace that seemed wrong for something so massive. We hit them with everything we had. Rockets, grenades, concentrated rifle fire, and for maybe 10 seconds I thought we were winning. Watched one of their machines stumble, watched its leg joints spark and fail. Then they returned fire, and I learned that winning had never been an option. Their weapons didn't shoot bullets or energy beams. They shot something that made physics optional, projectiles that passed through cover and found flesh, that killed in ways our medics couldn't explain because the wounds were mathematically impossible. Sergeant Reeves's chest just opened, ribs spreading like fingers, organs visible and steaming before he collapsed. Lieutenant Park was there, and then wasn't. Not disintegrated, but displaced, moved to somewhere else, and his screaming came from a direction that didn't exist. We retreated through burning streets, carrying wounded who'd been modified by Velkrin weapons into shapes that were technically still alive but shouldn't be, and behind us the machines followed slowly, patiently, like they had all the time in the world because they did, and we didn't. The sound of boots on stone, the taste of defeat, made it back to the tunnels with 14 soldiers, lost 16, including Reeves and Park and Private Chen, who'd stopped crying 3 days ago and started laughing instead, who'd run at the Velkrin machines with a grenade and succeeded only in proving that martyrdom was just another word for dying pointlessly. Harris met me at the checkpoint covered in blood that wasn't his, helping drag Corporal Vance, who'd lost both legs to something that had cut through body armor like it wasn't there. The civilians watched us return, and I saw the hope die in their eyes, saw them understand that outside wasn't salvation, was just a different way of being trapped. I went to my quarters, which was really just a corner of a maintenance tunnel with a cot and a desk, and I broke my hand punching the wall, because pain was the only thing that felt real anymore. The only sensation that wasn't fear or despair or the crushing weight of knowing I'd led people to die for nothing. We captured a Velcrin on day 8. Not captured exactly, it let itself be caught. Walked into one of our patrols in the shallow tunnels with its weapons powered down, its translator broadcasting surrender in 20 human languages. Lieutenant Zhao wanted to kill it immediately, but I said no, said maybe it could tell us something useful, said maybe there was intelligence value in a prisoner, even though I knew there wasn't. Knew that anything it told us would just be another way of confirming we'd already lost. We locked it in a storage chamber, and I went to interrogate it alone because I couldn't watch my officers hear what I suspected it would say. It was beautiful in a way that made me nauseous. Bipedal but wrong, proportions that seemed correct until you looked directly at them and realized nothing was where it should be, limbs that bent in too many places, skin that shifted colors like oil on water. Its face had eyes, I think, or sensors that served the same function, and when it looked at me I felt assessed, categorized, filed away in whatever mental database it kept for dying species. It spoke through the translator in a voice without emotion, flat and clinical. You are Captain Tyron Sue. You command this remnant. You believe resistance serves a purpose. I asked where the rest of humanity was. It paused, and I realized with horror that it was considering whether the truth would break me faster than a lie. Gone. Your orbital habitats were destroyed in the first strike. Your off-world colonies were sterilized simultaneously. Your fleet was eliminated at Saturn. This installation, and perhaps 12 others, represent the sum total of your species. Approximately 400,000 individuals across all sites. This represents 0.005% of your pre-war population. You are statistically extinct. The words hit like physics, like gravity reasserting itself, undeniable and crushing. I asked why they were doing this, why sterilization instead of conquest, and it tilted its head in what might have been confusion or pity. You resist entropy. All biology resists entropy. This is thermodynamically inefficient. We correct inefficiencies. Your species achieved technological sophistication sufficient to register as significant entropy resistance. Therefore, correction was necessary. This is not personal. This is mathematics. I asked about the preservation offer, whether they'd actually store us, or if that was just another lie to make surrender easier. It said, yes, they would preserve us, that they had preserved 47 species already, that we'd exist as data patterns in quantum storage, perfectly preserved, effectively immortal, completely dead. It explained that digital existence was superior to biological existence, that information outlasted matter, that we should be grateful for the opportunity to transcend our limitations. Its voice never changed pitch, never registered emotion, explained extinction like it was a favor they were doing us. I shot it, put my sidearm against what I thought was its head, and pulled the trigger until the magazine was empty. It died slowly, bleeding something that smelled like copper and electricity, and its last words through the failing translator were statistics about how many bullets I'd wasted, how that ammunition could have been used more efficiently, how I'd just killed the only Velcrin who'd bothered to explain anything. I left it in the storage chamber and walked back to command where Harris was waiting with news that oxygen levels were dropping faster than projected, that the recyclers were failing, that we had maybe 48 hours of breathable air left for 60,000 people. The sound of systems failing, the smell of too many humans waiting to suffocate. I made the decision on day 9. The civilians were getting violent, fighting over food, fighting over water, fighting over space to sleep in tunnels that were becoming more crowded as deeper sections flooded from groundwater seepage. A man had killed another man over a blanket. A woman had smothered her own children rather than watch them suffocate slowly. The soldiers were deserting, slipping away into the deeper tunnels to die privately, rather than face orders they knew were meaningless. Sergeant Kim came to me with the numbers, calculations showing we'd run out of everything before the Velcrin bothered to dig us out. that we'd die of thirst and hunger and suffocation in that order, that the fastest death would take 3 days and the slowest would take 2 weeks. The reactor core was in Deep Section 9, the power plant that kept the lights on and the air recyclers running and the water pumps operational. It was also technically a weapon if you disabled the safety systems, if you overrode the emergency shutdown protocols, if you decided that a quick death was preferable to a slow one. The explosion would be significant, would collapse every tunnel in the network, would kill everyone instantly, soldiers and civilians, children and elderly, everyone, would also destabilize the geological formations above us, likely trigger seismic events, possibly damage the Velcrin surface installations, would be, in the end, one last act of defiance before the universe erased us completely. I called a meeting of all remaining officers, told them what I was considering. Lieutenant Harris said it was murder. Captain Zhao said it was mercy. Lieutenant Park's replacement, a sergeant whose name I'd never learned, said it didn't matter what we called it, because words stopped meaning anything when your species was extinct. I put it to a vote because democracy seemed important even at the end, even when the vote was about whether to kill everyone we'd sworn to protect. 4 voted yes, 2 voted no. Harris abstained, which was really just voting yes while pretending otherwise. I made it unanimous by adding my vote, 7 officers deciding the fate of 60,000 civilians who didn't know they were being sentenced. We didn't tell them, couldn't tell them. The panic would kill people before the explosion did, would turn the tunnels into a massacre as everyone fought to escape to a surface that would kill them slightly slower. Instead, I told Sergeant Kim to begin evacuation protocols, told him to spread the word that we'd received word of a relief fleet, that extraction was imminent, that everyone needed to gather in the central chambers for organized departure. They believed him. God help us. They believed him because they wanted to, because hope was the only thing left, and they clutched it like a life preserver, even as it pulled them under. They gathered in the central chambers, families holding hands, strangers comforting strangers, 60,000 people believing they had a future that extended beyond the next 20 minutes. I went to the reactor core with Harris and Zhao. The engineers were dead or deserted, so we had to figure out the override manually, pulling panels and cutting wires and hoping we were disabling safety systems and not accidentally stabilizing the reaction. Harris was crying silently, tears running down his face while he worked, but his hands were steady. Zhao was praying in Mandarin, words I didn't understand, but recognized as the sound of someone trying to make peace with what they were about to do. I wasn't crying and wasn't praying, just felt numb, felt empty, felt like I'd already died, and this was just my corpse going through the motions. The reactor began to whine, harmonics building, vibrations we could feel through the floor. Harris asked if I was sure, one last chance to stop this, one last opportunity to let them die slowly instead of quickly. I thought about Private Chen crying at her station while logging the death of civilization, thought about Sergeant Reeves's chest opening like a flower, thought about the Velcrin prisoner explaining extinction like it was a math problem, thought about the civilians in the central chambers holding hands and believing in rescue. I told Harris to finish the override. The whine became a scream. The vibrations became shaking. Zhao finished her prayer and looked at me with eyes that were calm, accepting, almost peaceful. She said something I couldn't hear over the reactor noise, but I read her lips. Thank you. Harris pulled the final safety lever, and the reactor began its cascade failure, neutrons breeding out of control, heat building toward criticality, maybe 30 seconds before the explosion would start in the core and radiate outward at the speed of sound through rock. I triggered my radio, broadcast on all frequencies, military and civilian, knowing the Velcrin would hear but not caring anymore. This is Captain Tyron Sue, FOB Meridian. This is humanity's last transmission. We're activating the reactor overload. In approximately 20 seconds, this installation will cease to exist. We're not surrendering. We're not accepting preservation. We're choosing to die as humans, all of us, together. To anyone listening, we were here, we mattered, we fought, and if this is how mankind ends... The explosion came faster than projected. The reactor didn't cascade, it detonated, fusion reactions running backward and forward simultaneously, energy release equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. The shockwave hit before I finished speaking, before I could complete the final sentence, and the last thing I felt was heat and pressure and the knowledge that at least it was quick. At least they hadn't suffered. At least we'd denied the Velkrin the satisfaction of watching us die slowly. The tunnels collapsed in sequence, starting from deep Section 9 and radiating outward, millions of tons of rock and concrete falling inward, filling every chamber, crushing everything, turning the underground network into a tomb sealed from the inside. The civilians died without knowing what killed them, died believing in rescue, which was maybe the kindest lie I'd ever told. The soldiers died knowing, which was maybe the punishment they deserved for following orders that ended in murder. I died somewhere between the two, consciousness fading not from the explosion, but from the sudden absence of pressure, the realization that there was nothing left to command, nothing left to protect, nothing left but the echo of the final transmission still broadcasting into empty static. The surface installations registered the seismic event. The Velkrin machines paused in their sterilization, analyzed the data, calculated that FOB Meridian was no longer a threat, filed the information, and resumed burning the planet. In orbit, their fleet moved to the next phase of the operation, atmospheric processing that would strip Earth's remaining oxygen and leave it a dead rock suitable for eventual Velkrin colonization in approximately 10,000 years. They noted the loss of potential preservation subjects from FOB Meridian, approximately 400,000 data patterns they'd never collect. But the number was statistically insignificant compared to the billions already processed. In the ruins of the reactor core, in the space between seconds when death was happening but hadn't finished happening, in the quantum moment when consciousness was ending but hadn't ended yet, my last thought wasn't fear or regret or even hatred. It was pride. Pride that we'd chosen. Pride that even at the end, even when the choice was meaningless, we'd made it anyway. Pride that the Velkrin would have to mark FOB Meridian as self-terminated rather than neutralized, would have to note that their preservation offer had been rejected not out of ignorance, but defiance. Pride that somewhere in their mathematical archives, in their databases of corrected species, humanity would be recorded as the one that refused correction, that chose entropy over efficiency, that looked at immortality and said no. The transmission cut off mid-sentence, frequency going to static. The Velkrin recorded it, analyzed it, filed it under anomalous behavior, because they had categories for everything including defiance they didn't understand. The broadcast degraded quickly, signal scattering, but for maybe 3 hours it bounced around Earth's dying atmosphere, repeating fragments. Humanity's last transmission, not surrendering. We were here. Eventually, even the fragments faded, absorbed by ash clouds and ionization and the mathematical certainty of entropy that the Velkrin understood perfectly and we'd fought against until the last possible second. In the Andromeda galaxy, a research station receives an echo of the transmission 30 years later, distorted by distance and time, but recognizable as human origin. They analyze it, determine it came from a species that went extinct during the Velkrin correction sweep of Sector 7, file it in their archives. A scientist listens to the reconstructed audio and feels something approximating sadness, wonders briefly what it must be like to choose death over preservation, then moves on to other projects because wondering doesn't bring back extinct species. In the quantum foam beneath reality, in the spaces between dimensions where information goes when it's destroyed, in the mathematical structures that exist independent of matter, maybe something of us remains, not consciousness, not souls, just patterns, just echoes, just the residual information of 60,000 people who died believing in rescue, and one captain who killed them because slow death was worse than fast death. The universe doesn't care. Physics doesn't care. Entropy doesn't care. But we cared. We cared so much it killed us. And maybe that's enough. Maybe caring was always enough, even when it changed nothing, even when it saved no one, even when the last transmission cut off mid-sentence, and the static that followed was the only answer anyone would ever hear. The wind stopped. The fires burned out. The ash settled. Earth became a dead rock orbiting a living star. The Velkrin moved on to other corrections, other inefficiencies, other species who would resist and fail, and choose between preservation and extinction. And somewhere in the math, in the equations that governed their logic, humanity became a footnote, a data point, a corrected error. But the transmission remained, embedded in quantum noise, propagating through dimensions the Velkrin couldn't access because they'd optimized themselves past the ability to perceive them. A ghost signal, an echo of defiance. Words that would never be heard, but would never quite die. The final sentence I never got to finish, interrupted by explosion and death and the end of everything. But the words existed anyway, in possibility space, in the potential of what I meant to say, in the echo of intention that outlasts action. If this is how mankind ends, let them choke on our ashes.